Hello everybody and welcome back to a new episode of Convert a PSD Web Design to HTML and CSS. Wow, this thing is turning into an epic series. It's just turning into a lot of work. I mean, if you take the whole process of converting a PSD to HTML and CSS, it's really hours and hours and hours of work. So to break it down into chapters like this has been really difficult, but hopefully you guys are getting some use out of it. So today, working on the footer section. So let's go over, here's what we have in the last lesson. We began the initial markup for the main area, though we definitely need to do some more work in the sidebar section. Alright, so now we have this footer area. So let's take a look at what we have here. Let's zoom in, and the first thing is I notice there's a footer wrap, so this brown background needs to extend for the entire width of the screen. Okay, and then within it we have these three columns, and we have some styling for each. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to show you a different way now to code. First, we went into MacVim, that's an advanced editor. Then we used Espresso. We're still going to work in Espresso, but I'm going to show you another way to edit your code in real time, is to use the Web Developer toolbar. So what this does is it allows you to edit in real time your styling so you can see it update, as you can see right there. So this is a Firefox exclusive extension, and if you want it, just search for Web Developer toolbar. It's created by Chris Pedrick. And you can see it's just a simple add-on. You install it, restart Firefox, and when you do, you'll get this Web Developer toolbar added, and it allows you to do a bunch of things like disable JavaScript, edit the CSS. You can add these rulers, so if you want to make sure everything lines up, you can create rulers like that. You can, of course, do things like validation. You can even validate your local files, resizing. You can do lots of cool stuff. Now the primary thing we're going to be doing here is using the Edit CSS feature. I can do it like this, or I can use this shortcut right here. And that'll bring up this area. So there's one thing though. If we go and we edit the style.css, can you see that it gets rid of our backgrounds? And the reason is when you edit this, everything becomes local. So at that point, links to background images right here, that won't be accurate anymore because it'll be in terms of the root. So for example, if I turn that into IMG, that shows up again. But this can be really helpful because you can edit your stuff on the side and see it immediately reflected. So some of you mentioned that if you don't use Espresso, how can you use that kind of technique where you view the live preview? This is one way. So we'll do this in this lesson just to give you lots of different options. So how we're going to compensate for these images is I'm going to do a quick search and replace and find everything going up a directory to the images folder, and we're just going to make that like it's the root, and then we can later fix that. So now if I refresh and I go into the toolbar, we're all set to go. So next I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and we have this nice environment. So we're in our secondary section, we finished that up. Now we're going to work on the footer section. So we begin by getting that footer wrap div. If we come back and we go into index.html, if we come to the bottom, you'll see that we have the footer wrap, and that will allow us to have a background image that extends. And within the comments, somebody asked me, how come you have all of these container 24 wrappers? Remember, it's because we have all of these different sections that need to extend for the entire width of the browser window. So this background needs to. This background, if we limited it to one 960 container 24 element, everything beyond that width of 960 would be cut off. So there's your answer. Okay, so let's go in, and we have our footer wrap, so let's apply the background like so. So we'll begin by getting that background color, this brown background right here. Now I think it has a little bit of noise, so what we can do is we can just grab the noise that we have from this banner inner BG that we created earlier. So let's do that. We'll say background URL img banner inner bg dot JPG, and we do want that to repeat, so we can specify that, or it'll do that by default. Now the reason why you're not seeing this background, for example, even if we apply a color to this background as well, you won't see it because these three columns are floated, and that has caused the wrapper to collapse in on itself. So we'll do overflow hidden and make sure it contains those floats, and now they should pop up like so. Alright, let's get rid of the red, and now we have that. And notice how this background extends as much as needed. Okay, so now if we come back, you'll see though also, if we scroll down to the very bottom, he has a border here. And it's actually, he has kind of an inner border. So we can do that. Let's grab that color, and I'll show you a couple techniques for this. So first, let's grab the first color, and we'll say border top 1 pixel solid, and then that color. So you won't be able to see it too well. If I zoom in, maybe you can see it. And if I change that to red, you'll really see it. So now, there it is. But then we kind of want another layer. So you can see here it has another layer of the original background color. So in this case, we want multiple borders. How can we do that? So I'll show you another way that we can do borders. There's a couple methods. You can use a box shadow technique to get multiple borders. Firefox or Mozilla has a method for using multiple borders. I'll show you a cool way of using pseudo classes. So we'll say footer wrap, and we'll say before, and this is the before pseudo class. And what this means is we're going to add content before. And what we'll say here is content. What are we adding? Nothing, just a space. And what I want though is a border top, and we'll say 1 pixel solid red. And we got to give it a width because there's not really anything in it. So we'll say 100% of the footer wrap. And let's give it a position of absolute. And now do you see that come in? So this is an interesting way where you can use the before and after pseudo classes to apply additional effects. So if we do green, if I zoom in all the way, you can see now that the red is the inner and the green is the outer. So now we can just go and replace these. Okay, so what is the inner? It's going to be this one. Paste that in. And then the final one is going to be this default color. And we'll take that. And now we have that illusion. So that's one possible way that you can achieve that effect. Always good to have a lot of different tools in your tool belt. Okay, so the next step is, let's go ahead and style the actual footer itself. So footer wrap, footer. And the reason I'm not just typing footer is because there could be multiple footers on the page, but I only want to style the one that's within the footer wrap. And what we want in here is some padding all around. So we'll say 50 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. And now I'm going to come back to our project and zoom out a little more. And now you can see that's starting to look a lot better there with that alone. And now let's make sure the color is white so it's easier to read on that brown background, like you can see right so. And next, the buttons. The buttons need to be floated all the way to the right. So if I zoom out a little bit, notice how each button is on the right side. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And we'll say footer button, float to the right. And we'll align that a little more shortly. So we have this recent projects section, and we want to make that look a little bit more like it does in the design itself. So let's work on that right now. Recent projects. Okay, and I'll paste this next snippet in, and we go to the recent projects section, and we get all the list items, and we float them to the left. So right there, you see now they're floated a little bit better. Okay, and then we apply some margin right and margin bottom to them, and that gives it a little more breathing room right there. And then I want to give it some padding. And when you apply padding and then a background color, the background color shows through as the padding. So here you can see we have a background, but that's just that little bit of extra spacing there. But when we add padding all around, we get that. Very cool. But now, what happens when you hover over one of these? Nothing. So I'll zoom back in. If I hover over that, we want to have some kind of result. So we can do that as well. Recent projects, li, hover. And when you hover, let's set the background color to maybe a highlight. And we'll say EDAD4E. Okay, and green obviously isn't right. Let's change that to EDAD. Okay, now can you see it's very subtle. Hopefully you can see that on this resolution. If you hover over it, it's just a slightly darker shade. All right, now let's do it even more by adding a border that's a highlight. And we'll say give it a border color, and will be FCCC85. And yeah, again, these are somewhat arbitrary. It's just a highlight. So if you can see that, we're affecting our image right there, but we can fix that later. But if I hover over it, you get that little bit of border. You could even try doing an outline. Now that's not going to work in some older versions of IE, but the nice thing about that is it allows you to add outlines without affecting the flow, so you don't increase the width. So we'll stick with that method right now, and it just gives us a little more feedback that we are hovering over it. Okay, so now you see how these buttons are a little too far to the right? Why don't we push those away? So we could say footer button, and why don't we say it like this? Recent projects button, and we'll give it a margin right, and let's play around with the values a little bit. 40 pixels, I think that should be fine because we're going to be playing with the background here. So we just want to push it within the boundary so that it lines up nicely. And remember, now that you have the web developer toolbar, you can always get your ruler and later make sure that everything lines up the way you want it to. That's very important. Now, what you want to do from time to time when you're working like this is remember, if something happens, the browser crashes, you're going to lose all of this. So from time to time, come back and re-update your style sheet. Okay. All right, so let's continue on. I'd like to style the Twitter section, so we'll do Twitter, and we'll say footer p span. So let's come back to our project so we can see what we're working with. We have our free quote, recent projects, and we have this section, and it's an unordered list containing each list item with our tweet. So if we say p span, okay, we're targeting that date time area, the 5 hours ago via TweetDeck. All right, so let's do that. Footer p span, and it'll be display block because I want that line to be on its own. Right now, by default, the span will be inline, and that pushes it up, but we want it all on its own line, so we specify, no, that needs to be a block level element. That way it'll take up all of its own space. Next, I want to give it a color. So we could go into Photoshop and measure that if we need to. But we should know this color. And grab it, like so. Paste that in. Now, we also need to target the anchor tag. So I'll say Twitter, and get all anchor tags as well. Okay, now we got that, but the only problem though is that we're also specifying that the anchor should be block as well. So either way, maybe we can just update Twitter A and say display is inline or inline block, one or the other. Okay, and now that works. We come back to Photoshop though, we can also see, I'll zoom out a little bit, that text is italic. So let's apply that as well. Font style is italic. There you go. All right, that looks good. Okay, so now we need to style this site info section. This will be the area at the bottom. And again, that should technically extend as much as you need to. Even though it's likely that this will stay as it is, you might want to plan for the future, and just in case you want to add a couple paragraphs, about your company at the bottom, you don't have to worry about reslicing everything. So let's do that right now. If we go into Espresso, you'll see that at the bottom we have site info. So again, we have that wrapping element to make sure that everything can extend for the entire width of the background. Site info. And here we'll say site info. And I'll make sure site info should be capital or camel case. First, background, red. Let's see what we're working with. Okay, and now we have all of that, but we want to give it that blue background. So let's see if we did save anything. And we would want something like footer small. There it is. There's our background. Footer small bg.jpg. All right. Footer small bg.jpg. And again, we could say repeat X. Now, what that's going to do is it's just going to repeat, and then the bottom color will be cut off. But if we want it to repeat horizontally and vertically, we can say repeat. Or we now know it does that automatically. Okay. So the next step is I'm going to give this a base height for now, and we can adjust this later. And I'm going to say height of 50 pixels, and watch what happens if we also set the line height to 50 pixels as well. It'll vertically center any of the text within it, and you'll see that take effect shortly. Now let's also set a color of white, and because we will be floating the contents within it, we're going to make sure it contains its floats. And now that comes up. Overflow hidden is simply cutting off anything that comes below 50 pixels. But that's okay, because we're going to be pushing up everything in a moment. And then later, if we need to, we can remove these styles and it'll extend as much as we want. So now we can say site or even footer nav. And if we float that to the right, we can also come and say site info p, and we're going to float that one to the left. Float to the left. Okay, so that one's floated to the left, and now we see the beginnings of our navigation area, but that still doesn't seem to be showing up right, and that's because those list items within the nav are still block. So now I can say footer nav li, and make sure that those float to the left within their container. And now, can you see those are showing up right now? Okay, so now back, why isn't this text right here vertically centered? We've applied a line height, but the reason is we've applied the line height to the base wrapper, but it's likely that your paragraph is going to be bound to a different line height that you set above. So if you ever notice that, make sure you just restate it, and that'll make sure that it's bound to that new line height. And we've added just a little bit more weight so that it takes priority. Okay, so next we need to go and say footer nav a. And that color should be white as well. Now, we need to apply some spacing here, so I'm going to show you a cool technique, an advanced technique, again using pseudo classes. So if we go back into Photoshop, can you see that if we zoom in, they're separated by borders? So what would be done in the past is people would manually, within the markup, they'd create like these little spans and then they'd insert the pipe character. But that's lame, so we're not going to do that. Instead, we'll use before or after. So we'll say footer, nav, li, and before every single one, we're going to insert that. We'll say content is going to be the pipe. And we'll say padding. Let's give it some 5 pixels worth of padding. Now can you see that that pipe has been added and we've applied some padding. And next, let's give it some text shadow. And we'll push it down and it's just going to be 165665, which is just a very deep blue color. And now can you see that right there? Cool. But now we have this problem here. If I zoom out just a little bit more, or zoom in, we have a pipe before the home, and that doesn't seem to make much sense. So let's go ahead and get that first one. So I can say footer, nav, li, first child, so that'll target the very first list item within the nav, right? It'll target this one. And now I'll say before, so we're grouping these classes. And by the way, technically you should do 2 colons, but to compensate for older browsers, you can get away with 1 as well. And here we'll simply say content is nothing. And there we go, now it's disappeared. Okay, so now let's go back to site info and let's also apply a base text shadow. And if we want, why don't we see if we grab this and we paste it up top, that's going to apply that text shadow to all the text. And then if we remove it, that way we can remove it and put it all the way up in site info, and that's going to be bound to all of the text. And that looks extreme right now, but if we zoom out, it just adds a little bit, so it's a little more readable. Now I can also see here, if I zoom out some more, there you go. Let's go up to full size and make sure that the text, notice here, full size, the text seems to be pushing over to the right too much. So that's something we need to take a look at. It looks like if we extend it, it'll come out. But if we get too close, it'll be cut off. So we'll pay attention to that just a little bit. All right, so I'm going to copy this, come back into Espresso, back into style.css, paste it in, and now I want to update back to the relative path. So we'll get image and replace that like so, like we did at the beginning. So now if we come back, we close this out, refresh the page, and now we have the beginning of our navigation section. And everything looks good. I just want to make sure everything lines up. And again, we will be working on all the form elements at a later date. So that'll cover this area and these buttons. But now let's make sure that everything's lining up. So I'll go to the display ruler, and what we want here is if I scroll down, I want to make sure that this edge is lining up, because we want to make sure the navigation area lines up with the right edge, and it does. So that's good, and we want to make sure that this left edge lines up correctly as well. Okay, good. But now let's just remove it, and we can see that that's getting cut off just a little bit. Like so. So what we'll do is later, what we can do is implement media queries, where we can say if the browser window is less than, say, 700 pixels across, we could offer an entirely modified layout that takes advantage of that space better. It's just a matter of how much focus you want to put into a web design to make it compliant with all these different. So if you want, you could have a full width and then an 800 pixel width and then even a mobile width. To give you an example of somebody who does that wonderfully is Chris from CSS Tricks. Take a look. He has the full width and then slightly smaller width and then another width, and then he's got his mobile width. So he has all these different layouts, and the way he accomplishes that is by using CSS media queries. So we'll be taking a look at that at some point as well. All right, so let's refresh the page, see what we got here. We got our header, we've got our banner, we've got our main section that needs some JavaScript, we have our footer. Okay, in the next lesson, what are we doing next? We're building the tabbing system. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you some JavaScript, and that's going to turn this into a cool section where I can click on this and display all of the necessary information. So hope you guys are enjoying this, and stick around for the next lesson. Bye.